The dust lifted in the dry Arizona wind as investigators paused at the shallow, sun-hardened depression, sensing that what lay beneath would rupture the quiet desert silence and reopen a forgotten year. Even before the first brush swept sand aside, dread settled heavier than heat on their backs' unspoken pressure. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In the parched outskirts north of Tucson, the unearthed remains would soon be cataloged as Jane Doe for nearly 2 decades, a silent occupant of the county's cold archives. The discovery in 1983 was not the result of a targeted search, but a rancher's report of disturbed soil, coyote tracks, and a faint, unnatural geometry beneath the mesquite roots. The sheriff's office, understaffed and accustomed to migrants and transient disappearances, responded with procedural caution, photographing the site, mapping sun angles, and knotting tire ruts eroded by wind. Under the tan layers of desert fill, the bones were intact enough to suggest deliberate placement rather than careless concealment. What investigators saw in that first assessment was not horror but absence. No purse, no clothing fibers, no trace labeling her life, only the stark anonymity of skeletal form in a landscape that erases memory faster than rain evaporates. A forensic anthropologist from the University of Arizona arrived within days, measuring femur length, estimating age, and noting the resilience of dental enamel against decades of sand abrasion. She determined the woman had been young, between 20 and 24, with no clear indicators of childbirth or major bone trauma. The wisdom teeth pattern, clavicle fusion stage, and pelvic characteristics guided them toward a narrow demographic that would, in theory, simplify the missing persons match. Yet the 1983 county records, handwritten in fragile binder pages, did not provide the clarity investigators hoped for. Names of young women who vanished in the late 70s and early 80s were scattered across jurisdictions. Some hitchhikers, some students who left dorms for summer travel and never returned, some runaways whose families had stopped answering calls from police months after their disappearances. Without DNA databases, without shared digital systems, investigators relied on dental chart comparisons mailed in manila envelopes, hopping for a match that never arrived. The case's initial momentum stalled by winter of 1983, when the desert's night chill replaced the bitter sun, and the media shifted toward more immediate crises. Local newspapers printed brief columns about an unidentified young woman, estimated date of death uncertain, no evidence of violent cause beyond the stark fact of death itself. Forensic testing showed no bullet impacts, no blade scoring, no defensive fractures. The bones spoke only through placement, through the careful, intentional burial that implied the perpetrator either cared or feared discovery enough to shape a grave with measured depth. Detectives speculated privately about acquaintance involvement, the quiet disposal away from paved roads, the absence of clothing that indicated either ritual removal or simple decay. Each theory dissolved under the weight of insufficient evidence. Across the years that followed, archivists filed her under numeric designation rather than name, shifting her storage box as the department remodeled. In 1991, the bones were re-examined, and a forensic odontologist noted unique dental work, a molar filled with a composite rarely used in Arizona but common in northern states during the late 1970s. They reached out to Montana, Idaho, and Washington dental boards, requesting long-shot cross-references. The responses returned in uneven intervals, none offering the closure investigators needed. While Tucson expanded outward, building shopping centers near the once remote locus of discovery, the young woman's identity remained tied to sterile lab notes and yellowing Polaroids of desert soil. By the early 2000s, advances in DNA sequencing offered renewed promise. The remains were temporarily transferred to a modern facility, where degraded bone fragments were cautiously cleaned, drilled, and analyzed for mitochondrial DNA. The genetic code, though incomplete, was viable enough to enter emerging databases. In 2006, the profile was submitted to a newly coordinated national missing persons network, yet matches were sparse, limited by the fact that many missing individuals from the era lacked family reference samples. Still, the digitization of records altered the potential trajectory of the case, linking county clerk logs, DMV archives, and college enrollment rosters that once existed in isolation. As the information age accelerated, advances reached even the quieter corners of Pima County's cold case unit. In 2015, the bones, once again prioritized, underwent forensic isotope testing, tracing oxygen signatures to determine regional water intake patterns from the woman's upbringing. Results indicated a Midwestern origin, distancing her from Tucson's local missing persons. Investigators narrowed focus to university students who migrated seasonally or temporarily to Arizona, drawn by the Sonoran climate, the art scene, or cross-state travel. Eventually, one profile surfaced from decades-old flyers. A 22-year-old journalism student from Illinois named Rebecca Hale, last contacted in spring of 1982. Hale had boarded a bus to explore the Southwest after exams, intending to interview environmental activists for an independent project. Her postcards home ceased abruptly after she reached Albuquerque. Her family filed a report in Illinois, but jurisdictional gaps prevented meaningful follow-up. With Hale's name, investigators retrieved sealed Illinois records, including dental charts and fingerprint cards from her college employment office. Although fingerprints could not be recovered from skeletal remains, the dental comparison finally aligned. The distinct composite filling matched her chart exactly. In 2017, Tucson authorities formally identified the desert remains as those of Rebecca Hale, aged 22 at death, a young woman whose academic notes and photography rolls remained archived in her family's basement, untouched relics of a life interrupted. The identification, while significant, reopened the investigative question long buried by desert sand: how Hale died and who placed her in that measured grave beyond Tucson's paved reach. Detectives reconstructed her route through bus schedules, hotel receipts, and a half-preserved journal her parents shared. Her last noted interview attempt concerned a reclusive ranch owner known for disputes over water rights and land conservation. That ranch sat within 10 miles of the discovery site, on land rarely traveled except by ranch hands and surveyors. Weathered county maps confirmed an old access road, one matching faded tire ruts documented in 1983. Investigators revisited the ranch, now owned by the son of the original proprietor. The man maintained meticulous archives of land leases and visitor logs dating back to 1979. Hale's name did not appear, yet a receipt for a short-term stay dated May 1982 listed an unnamed female journalist. The handwriting resembled the elder rancher's, who had died in 1998, leaving behind no direct testimony. Neighbors recalled the elder man as stern, solitary, inflexible about trespassing. Still, no witness recalled any criminal behavior. Detectives combed through property line disputes, tax records, and a 1984 sealed harassment complaint filed by a seasonal worker, hinting at an environment difficult for outsiders. Despite the suspicion, no definitive link tied the elder rancher to Hale's disappearance. The burial itself suggested limited panic, an act carried out with calm procedural intent. Soil analysis from 2018 detected traces of specialized canvas fibers, possibly from a tent or equipment bag. It implied Hale may have camped on the property willingly, pursuing her environmental story, unaware that isolation can become vulnerability in open desert terrain. The autopsy reports, though limited, noted no catastrophic skeletal injuries, returning investigators to theories of heat stroke, dehydration, or misadventure. Yet the organized burial complicated any accidental narrative. The renewed inquiry drew attention to another name buried in archives, a drifter who worked on multiple ranches during the summer of 1982, a man with trespass citations in Nevada and Colorado, known for offering rides to hikers and travelers. His personnel records listed him as Milo Trent, age 28 at the time, with a history of intermittent labor and a quiet departure from Tucson 1 month after Hale disappeared. When contacted in 2019, Trent, now living in Oregon, consented to a recorded interview. He recalled meeting a young woman with a camera near a remote trailhead, offering her water and directions to a shaded wash. He claimed they parted amicably, and he traveled north days later for seasonal logging work. His statements, though bland, held factual consistencies with bus schedules and road conditions of that week. No physical evidence tied Trent to Hale, but the circumstantial lines converged. Proximity, timing, and the nature of Hale's journey fractured by isolation. Yet the burial indicated someone with land knowledge, a person comfortable excavating in arid soil without drawing attention. That pointed more strongly to the late rancher than to Trent, whose itinerant lifestyle lacked rooted territorial patterns. In the months leading to the 40th anniversary of the discovery, Pima County's forensic unit employed advanced 3D reconstruction to model the burial posture, evaluating whether the grave's dimensions suggested one person digging or two. The results indicated a single digger with methodical spacing, consistent with farm tool use rather than construction equipment. That detail renewed focus on the elder rancher's toolshed inventory, where a 1982 purchase log showed a new spade and canvas tarp bought weeks before Hale's last known communication. As 2022 closed, the case lacked formal closure but had gained undeniable clarity. Hale was known, her route reconstructed, her final resting place no longer silent. The desert, once indifferent witness, had returned enough fragments for the living to interpret. Investigators prepared a submission for prosecutorial review regarding posthumous suspicion of the rancher, acknowledging the impossibility of trial but seeking official designation of probable involvement. The file, once cold and unmarked in a steel drawer, now held identity, trajectory, and a restrained approximation of truth that decades earlier seemed unreachable. The desert had not forgotten entirely. It had simply waited for tools precise enough to translate its silence with formal certification. The reclassification of the case in early 2023 redirected all remaining investigative focus toward evidentiary reconstruction rather than prosecution. Because the suspected party had been deceased for 25 years, the district attorney's office emphasized confirmation, documentation, and ethical closure rather than adversarial proceedings. In the windowless archives of the Pima County Justice Complex, clerks opened file boxes marked only by accession numbers and outdated evidence seals, retrieving objects long untouched. Among the items cataloged in 1983, but never fully examined with modern techniques, was a soil-stained glove, formerly dismissed due to lack of biological traces discernible at the time. Modern forensic labs, equipped with microscopic protein detection systems, found minute keratin fragments embedded in the glove fibers. Although degraded, They hinted that the glove belonged neither to Hale nor to any known investigator on record. While inconclusive, it contributed to the growing network of circumstantial details that nested around the late rancher. His property's proximity, his purchasing history, his documented isolationism, and the quiet burial consistent with lived familiarity with the land. As forensic anthropology continued its re-examination of Hale's remains, a subtle but significant discovery emerged. When ultraviolet imaging was applied to bone surfaces, slight mineral deposits revealed patterns aligned with gradual sun exposure before burial, suggesting that her body may have remained above ground under shade for an interim period before being interred. This supported the theory that the death was not an impulsive act requiring immediate concealment. Instead, it suggested measured deliberation, time taken to determine the location, depth, and spacing of the grave. If the death had been accidental, the subsequent burial demonstrated an awareness of accountability, a desire to control narrative and memory rather than to summon assistance. The Hale family received news of the identification and investigative progress in a private briefing in 2023. They declined televised interviews and public commentary, choosing to preserve what remained of their daughter's historical record without conversion into spectacle. Their chief request concerned the recovery and return of her personal items, including the camera she was last known to have carried. That camera, despite trace mentions in notes from 1982, was never recovered. Investigators hypothesized it may have remained on the ranch, discarded or salvaged for parts, but no evidence surfaced. The absence of the camera, if anything, reinforced the interpretation that her final days involved documentation beyond journalism, perhaps environmental interest, perhaps topography, perhaps simple curiosity driven by desert solitude. The investigation could not assign motive to her last movement beyond travel intent, and thus preserved the limitations inherent in factual narrative. Hot Tucson summers passed, and each reanalysis yielded fragments significant not for drama, but for clarity. The isotopic signatures from Hale's teeth, combined with the newly run database comparisons, allowed genealogical experts to confirm her Midwestern childhood with advanced precision, narrowing her developmental water exposure to a corridor between Chicago and western Illinois. This aligned precisely with her known upbringing outside Peoria, confirming the reliability of the 2015 isotope testing and removing any speculative doubt regarding misidentification. These science-based confirmations restored what decades of desert silence had nearly erased: factual continuity between a young woman's life and its unexplained cessation. Across the investigative timeline, the location of Hale's burial emerged as the most eloquent indicator of perpetrator involvement, indirectly testifying to both control and privacy. The grave's sloping orientation matched older survey maps of the ranch property, maps that displayed pre-development contours of washes, cattle paths, and maintenance lanes long since absorbed by commercial expansion. Though indistinct to the untrained eye in 1983, the grave's location aligned with a hidden access route known only to original owners and hired labor. This detail, although it could not determine guilt, firmly placed the final act within the purview of someone with established land familiarity. In the absence of confession, the geography spoke. Throughout 2024, cold case analysts compiled a comprehensive digital dossier. These analysts, formerly collision reconstruction specialists and archivists, created layered geographic visualizations showing the desert terrain across decades. Satellite overlays of 1982, 1995, and 2020 imagery confirmed that the burial site was once shielded by natural growth and land curvature, making accidental discovery unlikely before erosion modified the area. This invisibility, though not proof of intent, demonstrated a calculated selection of a location that would delay discovery indefinitely. The district attorney issued a quiet conclusion. While prosecution was no longer possible, the late rancher was named as the primary and sole suspect based on circumstantial convergence. The language was deliberate and restrained, avoiding sensational terms or speculative motive. Instead, it cited land access, tool purchase history, campsite receipt timing, burial depth, and Hale's direct proximity to the property in her final days. It did not claim violence definitively, nor assign narrative beyond evidence-supported inference. The conclusion neither romanticized nor dramatized. It simply recorded. The public response was minimal. Without living perpetrator, without trial, without courtroom closure, media interest declined after a single cycle. For many in Tucson, the case had long existed as a whispered desert legend, folded into collective memory alongside countless stories of travelers who underestimated the breadth and silence of the Southwest. The identification of Hale and the confirmation of her resting site ended that narrative subtly. Local broadcasters summarized the resolution in 2-minute evening segments, focusing on forensic advancement rather than personal tragedy. In the 4 decades since her death, the city had expanded around the once remote site, and new residents driving past housing blocks and retail plazas remained unaware that beneath their paved routes, archives once stored the only proof that a young visitor ever crossed their horizon. The handling of Hale's remains transitioned from evidence classification to memorial categorization. Tucson's forensic unit scheduled a private repatriation, free of ceremony, and transferred custody to her family. The event occurred in late autumn, under a calm sky and without recording devices. What remained of Hale's life in Tucson existed on paper: bus logs, receipt scans, anthropological measurements, and quiet notations etched by investigators across decades. These documents, preserved in the county's expanded digital cold case library, became permanent reference material for training programs in investigative persistence. The investigative community reflected on the case not as a dramatic triumph, but as a demonstration of meticulous procedure across time. In an era when resolution is frequently tied to confession or trial spectacle, the Hale case illustrated the legitimacy of reconstructed truth. No witness testimony emerged, yet the analytical process confirmed identity, traced geographic narrative, and isolated suspect motive within stable legal terminology. The final result, neither accused beyond evidence nor excused the circumstances of burial. Hale's name, once absent from the dusty 1983 ledger, appeared in updated death registry records, replacing the non-identifying index number. Her age at death, 22, documented formally at last, corrected the silence that 40 years of desert weathering imposed. The geographic coordinates of her discovery, once confidential, became footnote data accessible to researchers studying historical missing persons cases in arid regions. The burial itself, remarkable only for its restraint and quiet exactness, entered forensic literature as an example of deliberate interment without accompanying trauma markers. In closing summaries, analysts cited the unusual blend of isolation, land familiarity, and measured concealment as culturally reflective of rural frontier holdovers stretching into the 20th century. The case affirmed that not all violent deaths present evident trauma, and not all disappearances involve pursuit, flight, or witness. Sometimes the landscape becomes both witness and accomplice, withholding testimony until technology develops to translate it. The desert's silence, while never conspiratorial, proved absolute. Only persistent record linkage, scientific reinterpretation, and careful archival maintenance created the path to Hale's identification. In the months following the conclusion, the Cold Case Unit filed the Hale dossier into the Resolved archives. Its labels read not with triumph but with procedural clarity. Identification achieved, circumstances classified, suspect confirmed posthumously as sole actor in burial, legal action closed by death of involved party. Rarely do such classifications carry emotional closure, yet they satisfy the obligations of factual record-keeping. For Hale's family, the confirmation meant an end to inquiry rather than revival of loss. Her mother, in a letter filed privately in the case record, expressed gratitude for the absence of spectacle and for the quiet nature of the resolution. The letter requested no further updates and asked that Hale's name be preserved only in accuracy, not narrative expansion. The Arizona desert, unchanged in its elemental indifference, retained no imprint of the investigation after the final paperwork was stored. Yet the case stood as evidence that time, science, and careful custodianship can revive the identity of a young traveler from a sun-hardened depression in the earth. It demonstrated that even without confession, trial, or motive articulation, the documentary truth of a life interrupted can be restored. In that restoration, the system met its responsibility. In that closure, the desert's long-held silence finally released its single, necessary answer. The period following official closure did not dismiss the investigative obligations that persisted in documentation, preservation, and quiet evaluation of remaining fragments. The Tucson Cold Case Division, aware that solved status did not eliminate academic interest, transferred the Hale file to a controlled research archive in partnership with anthropological departments across Arizona. The purpose was not to dissect narrative, but to preserve methodology for future desert identifications. Without interview circuits or courtroom summaries, the silence around her story became deliberate. Hale's presence in the record was now factual, defined by verifiable markers rather than absence. Her identity, once dust-dimmed, returned not through dramatic revelation, but through layers of recorded examination that never strayed beyond procedural confines. This kind of resolution rarely drew attention, yet it represented a rare alignment between what science could recover and what the desert had allowed to remain. As the months progressed, archivists finalized digital backups of soil reports, isotope readings, photographic burial reconstructions, and geographic overlays. These files, once singular and fragile on paper, existed now in redundant systems designed to outlast fluctuations in institutional leadership, budget reductions, and public interest cycles. Hale's reconstructed path through Tucson bus lines, access roads, and ranch perimeters offered a model for other cases involving remote landscape disappearance. The case taught that resolution in arid terrain depends not solely on physical evidence, but on reinterpreting earlier data with modern precision. What once appeared as blank, uncommunicative space in 1983 became legible terrain through 40 years of evolving geospatial tools. The final restoration of her name to state records was conducted without ceremony, entered into the system by a clerk during routine operations. The date of death remained approximate, narrowed to a window consistent with her last known sightings and journal notations. No attempt was made to assign an exact day or hour. The case avoided conjecture even at the closing entry, acknowledging that desert weather patterns, scavenger timelines, and exposure intervals could not be reverse-engineered into specific chronology. Forensic restraint defined the resolution more strongly than any single fact. Though the state chose not to issue a public memorial, a quiet plaque was requested by her family for placement at a small cemetery in Illinois. The travel of her remains from Tucson to the Midwest marked the only formal movement she would make after decades in unknown ground. The interment was private, echoing the tone of the entire investigation. No broadcast, no dramatization, no interviews. The family's insistence on privacy was noted respectfully by authorities, who refrained from public statements beyond acknowledging identification. The minimal attention reflected an understanding that some cold cases achieve closure not through narrative restoration, but through factual confirmation alone. The unresolved element of motive remained archived rather than speculated. The official record did not attempt to explain why the burial occurred away from any recognized path. The absence of documented struggle, combined with intact skeletal form and controlled interment, left investigators with only evidence of aftermath, not cause. That limitation, a central feature of many desert recoveries, did not undermine identification, but underlined the boundaries of forensic interpretation. The state adhered to these limitations, declining to attach narrative intent to a case that contained no admissible statements, confessions, or behavioral testimony. Hale's story became an example of how resolution can exist without full reconstruction. In broader procedural review, the case contributed to improved coordination across jurisdictions. It underscored the necessity of maintaining missing persons records beyond immediate investigative windows, and showed that disappearance reports filed in one state may require action in another decades later. The combination of isotope testing, DNA extraction from degraded bone, and archival bus trajectory mapping demonstrated that long-term disappearance resolution relies on cumulative rather than instantaneous discovery. Hale's identification, achieved through iteration rather than breakthrough, reinforced confidence in systems designed to span generations rather than news cycles. The professional community responded with academic interest, citing the case in conferences dedicated to forensic anthropology and long-term cold case resolution. Presenters referenced the burial orientation, land familiarity implications, and the ethics of posthumous suspect attribution. The emphasis, consistent across disciplines, was on evidentiary convergence rather than personal speculation. The Hale case served as a reminder that truth in cold cases is often granular, reconstructed through accretion rather than revelation. That tempo, though unsuited to public expectation for narrative closure, aligned with the responsibilities of investigative science. In later internal reviews, the Cold Case Division acknowledged that without consistent data preservation from 1983 onward, identification might never have been achievable. Each piece of evidence, from the initial Polaroid site images to the handwritten ranch supply invoice, contributed meaningfully to reconstructed identity. For investigators who entered the field long after Hale's disappearance, the case became a testament to archival endurance. It demonstrated that accuracy maintained in eras of limited technology can serve future analysis when scientific tools mature. As the desert continued its seasonal cycles, erasing physical traces and renewing growth around the former burial site, the case's final chapter remained in paperwork rather than landscape. No marker was placed at the original grave location. The land, developed and reclassified over decades, no longer resembled its 1982 structure. Commercial zoning maps replaced cattle trail spans, and residential blocks edged into former open field. Memory of the exact burial position existed only in coordinate logs preserved by the county. The anonymity of that ground mirrored the anonymity Hale had endured in archival drawers. Now, both belonged to record-keeping rather than physical memory. Long after official closure, investigators occasionally cited the Hale case during onboarding sessions for new forensic staff. Its importance lay in sustaining diligence even when immediate relevance seemed absent. Hale, unknown for decades, eventually received identification not because a witness surfaced or a confession arrived, but because the system never discarded her file. That continuity, maintained through staff turnover and shifting investigative priorities, resulted in the modest but complete outcome: a name restored, a file resolved, and a family able to conclude without spectacle. In the end, the desert did not surrender an explanation, only identity. That was enough. Hale's presence in Tucson's archival network transformed from numeric index to confirmed individual. Her life, documented now to its terminus, entered quiet permanence within state records. The case, devoid of theatrics, remained significant precisely for its restraint. It proved that forensic investigation can honor the boundaries of what cannot be known while accomplishing what must be known. The final result was a name reclaimed from erasure and a case transferred from active pursuit to historical certainty, preserved not for retelling but for recognition. In that austere conclusion, the work of 40 years met its obligation, and the desert's long silence at last was responsibly answered.